It begins with a photograph, faded at the edges, curled like old parchment, its surface glazed with the dull sheen of time. 7 figures stand in the frame, their bodies stiff, their faces unsmiling. The year is 1891. A boy, no older than 15, stares at the camera with eyes too solemn for his age. Behind him, a father with a jaw set like stone. Beside them, a mother whose hands grip her dress as if to hold something inside. The rest are children, clustered like shadows. At first glance, it is nothing more than a family portrait from another century. But linger on it, and something begins to stir in the space between them. The light in the image feels wrong, as though the day was overcast, even if the sun was shining. The boy's gaze lingers longer than it should, as if he knew you would be looking back one day. This is the Murphy family, and every son you see in this photograph is already dead. Not yet, not then, but in the years to come, each one would meet the same fate, at the same age, in the same unbroken pattern. 21 years old. No exceptions. The records are not vague, not hearsay whispered across kitchen tables. They are written, signed, dated in the town's official ledgers, death certificates sealed in ink that still smells faintly of iron. 4 generations, each carrying the same sentence. First it seemed like tragedy, the kind any family might endure once. A fall from a hayloft, a fever in the night. But grief has a way of pulling you back to the moments before it struck, making you notice what you didn't see at the time. The father who never celebrated birthdays, the mother who wore black even in summer, the locked doors on certain nights of the year. Neighbors began to notice too. They spoke of it in hushed tones, glancing over shoulders, as if the family name itself carried a weight. One by one the Murphys buried their sons, each loss folding into the last until the pattern could no longer be denied. Yet still, no one could explain it. Was it a sickness, a curse, something carried in the blood? The photograph remains, silent and still, the only place where all of them are together. And when you look at it now, you might find your eyes drifting back to the boy in the middle, the one who stares too directly into the lens, the one who seems to know what's coming. You might wonder what he saw the day the photograph was taken, and whether something just out of frame was staring back. The morning of his 21st birthday began like any other. A thin frost clung to the grass, brittle underfoot, the kind that catches the first light and scatters it in pale shards. Inside the Murphy farmhouse, the air was still, the silence broken only by the slow, steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Thomas Murphy Jr. rose before dawn, just as he always had, pulling on his boots without a word. He was a broad-shouldered young man, the sort who could lift a hay bale with ease, but his eyes held a tiredness that did not belong to his age. His father sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, watching him move about the room, not speaking, not smiling, just watching. Neighbors would remember that in the weeks before this day, the patriarch's manner had changed. He had stopped going into town, stopped speaking to anyone who came by the farm. Some saw him standing in the field at dusk, staring toward the barn as if waiting for something. Others swore they heard him muttering prayers under his breath, though his lips barely moved. That morning, he followed Thomas out to the yard, his heavy boots sinking into the cold earth. He lingered there for a long moment before turning back inside, his shoulders drawn tight, as though bracing for a blow he could not stop. By mid-morning, the town was buzzing. Thomas had been found in the hayloft, his body crumpled on the packed dirt floor below. They said he must have slipped while stacking bales, the fall snapping his neck instantly. A simple, tragic accident. But those who knew the Murphys best could not shake the feeling that it had been more than that. The father did not weep. He did not speak of his son again. At the funeral, he kept his eyes fixed on the coffin, jaw locked, his hands clasped as if holding something back. The clock in the hallway stopped that day, its pendulum frozen in place. It was never wound again, and though no one could prove anything, the neighbor who had seen him standing in the fields swore that the man's face, in those final weeks, was not one of fear, but of grim acceptance, as if he had been waiting for the hour to arrive, as if he had known that, when the clock struck 21 years, there would be no more time left for his eldest son. It was a plain book at first glance, its leather cover worn smooth, its spine frayed from years of handling. No name on the front, no title on the side, just a ledger, forgotten in a trunk beneath a blanket of dust in the attic of the long-abandoned Murphy home. The air up there was stale and dry, thick with the smell of wood that had absorbed a century of winters. When the pages were opened, the ink had not faded as much as it should have. Every line was written in the same neat, deliberate hand, the hand of Margaret Murphy, Thomas Jr. Say, Mother. Her entries began just days after her eldest son's funeral in 1893. At first they seemed ordinary enough, weather notes, crop yields, household expenses, but woven between these mundane details were phrases that sat strangely on the page. 17 years, 3 months, 6 days remaining. He is quiet today. The house feels heavier. The wind came from the east again. Mark this. These notations began to form a pattern, small threads running alongside the ordinary life she recorded. For each son, the countdown began on the day they turned 4. At first the numbers were large, almost harmless in their distance, but as they dwindled, the tone of her entries shifted. Her handwriting grew smaller, tighter. 1 year, 12 days, the shadow at the window again. 4 months, 5 days, dreams return. The ledger did not explain these cryptic remarks, but they were always placed near the edges of the page, as though they were meant to be hidden in plain sight. The last weeks before each 21st birthday were filled with strange symbols, circles within circles, drawn in thick ink that bled through to the other side. Sometimes there were no words at all, only these shapes repeated over and over, page after page. In the margins, faint fingerprints could be seen, smudges that suggested she had handled the book in haste, or with trembling hands. Whoever found the ledger decades later admitted they could not read it for long. There was something about the careful precision of those numbers, the certainty of the countdowns, that felt oppressive, as if the pages themselves were keeping time. And though Margaret never wrote the word curse, or fate, or death, she never once recorded a 22nd birthday. The ledger ended each time a son reached the final day. The entry would be brief, almost reluctant, just the date, a short line, he has gone, and then nothing, until the countdown for the next boy began. The summer of 1914 was warm and windless, the kind of season when the lake behind the Murphy property lay still as glass. Patrick Murphy, the eldest of his generation, had always been drawn to that water. On his 21st birthday, he took the family's small rowboat out just before dusk. The sun hung low, its reflection spilling across the lake like molten copper. Neighbors later said they watched him from a distance, the oars dipping slowly, rhythmically, as though he were in no hurry to return. There was no storm that night, no sudden change in weather, no reason for concern. But when the boat drifted back toward shore the next morning, it was empty. One oar still rested in its lock, the other floating a few feet away. The surface of the lake was calm, unbroken. His body was never found. At first the town searched. Men dragged the lake with ropes and hooks, others walked the banks, calling his name. But the Murphys themselves did not join them. Patrick's father stood at the water's edge only once, his face unreadable, and then turned back toward the house. His mother did not come outside at all. Within days the search was abandoned, and Patrick was declared dead. For his younger brothers, the loss was more than grief. It was confirmation. They had grown up with whispers, half-finished sentences, and the heavy presence of that ledger kept in the drawer. They had seen the way the adults measured their birthdays with unease. Now they understood the shape of the thing that had been hanging over them all along, even if no one dared name it. In the weeks after Patrick's disappearance, the Murphy house grew quieter. Laughter, once rare, vanished entirely. The brothers spoke little, their eyes sliding toward each other in moments of silence, as if sharing the same unspoken thought. 21. One stopped going into town. Another began keeping to his room. They were not afraid in the way children fear monsters. It was something colder, heavier, the acceptance that an invisible line waited for them, and there was no way to step around it. Years later, an old man who had lived near the lake claimed that on certain calm evenings he could see the outline of a small boat far from shore. A figure sat inside, motionless, watching the land. The boat would fade with the last light, leaving only the stillness of the water behind. The night before Patrick took the boat out, the Murphy family gathered for dinner. It was late summer, the kind of evening when the air in the farmhouse held a faint sweetness from the fields, and the windows glowed with the orange light of sunset. The table was set neatly, each place arranged with care, but the meal itself sat untouched. Patrick's mother had prepared stew, thick and dark, steam curling from the pot in the center. She ladled it into bowls, one by one, her hands steady, her face unreadable. No one reached for a spoon. Patrick sat at one end of the table, his father at the other. Between them, the rest of the family shifted in their chairs, glancing from one to the other, but never speaking. His father's eyes were fixed on him, unblinking, the weight of his gaze pressing heavier with each passing minute. It was not anger, it was not fear, it was something else. A quiet, immovable knowing. Patrick kept his head down at first, but eventually he looked up, and for a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the length of the table. The only sound was the grandfather clock in the hall. Its ticking filled the spaces where conversation should have been, a slow, deliberate beat, marking the moments they were not speaking. No one remembers hearing laughter that night. No one remembers a single word spoken by Patrick's father. The children shifted in their seats, their spoons moving just enough to stir the stew but never to taste it. Even the air felt thick, as if it resisted sound. A neighbor, invited that evening by Margaret Murphy herself, later described the atmosphere as a dinner for someone who was already gone. She could not explain why she felt that way, only that it seemed as if the family was gathered to watch something pass, though nothing had happened yet. Patrick, she said, seemed calm, too calm. When the meal ended, the plates were still full, the bread untouched, the stew cooling in its bowls. Patrick's father stood slowly, never breaking his gaze, and left the table without a word. Patrick followed moments later, his chair scraping softly against the wood floor. The rest of the family remained seated, listening to the footsteps fade into the distance, and then to the silence that followed. That was the last evening they would see him alive, and for those who were there, the memory of that ticking clock, steady, patient, relentless, would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The discovery came by accident. In the summer of 1932, a crew was hired to clear part of the old Murphy farmland for new planting. The ground there was uneven, dotted with half-collapsed fence posts and stones that had been sinking slowly into the earth for decades. The men worked with shovels at first, then picks, until one struck wood with a dull, hollow thud. At 2 feet down they uncovered the outline of a coffin, old, weathered and rotting at the corners. It wasn't unusual to find forgotten graves on rural land, and at first no one thought much of it. But when they pried the lid open, they found something strange. The coffin was too large for its contents. Nestled inside, surrounded by empty space, was a second casket, smaller and in far better condition. Its polished surface still caught the light, as though it had been sealed only years before, not decades. Confused, the workers set to opening the second one, prying the nails loose carefully, almost reluctantly. Inside was the body of a young man, or rather what remained of him. Bones fragile as porcelain, but the clothes he wore were almost untouched by time. A white shirt, a dark vest, trousers neatly pressed, shoes that still held their shape. There was no nameplate, no marker, no sign of who he had been. The air inside the casket was oddly dry, carrying none of the sour smell the workers had expected. One of them swore it felt cooler, as though the grave itself had been holding its breath. News spread quickly through the small town. The story grew with each telling. Some said the body belonged to a Murphy son who had died young, hidden away to protect him from whatever curse haunted the family. Others whispered that the second coffin was a way of keeping the dead close, as though burial alone wasn't enough to contain them. A few claimed the young man wasn't dead at all when he was placed inside, that the Murphys had locked him away to fulfill some grim obligation. The town officials ordered the coffin resealed and reburied on the property, but the questions never faded. Why hide a grave inside another grave? Why preserve the clothes so carefully? And why, in a family that had lost so many sons, was this one not given a name? Long after the workers had gone, locals said the patch of ground where the coffins were found felt different beneath the feet, softer, as though it had never truly settled. And when the wind moved across it at night, some swore they heard the faintest sound. Not the creak of trees, not the sigh of grass. Something closer to a slow, deliberate knocking from far below. By the 1940s, the story of the Murphys was no longer a family matter. It belonged to the town. People told it in barbershops, in churchyards after Sunday service, in the hushed voices of mothers warning their children not to wander too close to the Murphy land. They called it a curse, though no one agreed on what kind. What everyone did agree on was this: no Murphy boy lived past 21. By then, the rules in the Murphy house had hardened into something unbreakable. Once a son turned 18, he stopped appearing in town. No one saw him at the general store or walking to school. Friends who called were turned away at the door. Some claimed to have glimpsed pale faces watching from the upstairs windows, quick to vanish when spotted. The boys were kept inside, away from strangers, away from the world. It didn't help. Whether guarded or free, whether watched or hidden, the end came all the same. In those years the deaths seemed quieter, less dramatic than the accidents of the past. One boy was found lifeless in his bed, his eyes open to the ceiling. Another collapsed in the barn, while feeding the horses, the bucket still in his hand. One simply stopped speaking mid-conversation at the kitchen table and never took another breath. The town physician could never find a cause. Heart failure appeared again and again on the papers, though the boys had been strong and healthy only days before. The doctor's voice would falter when pressed for details. He never stayed long at the Murphy home after a death. Neighbors who lived close enough claimed the nights leading up to each passing were strange. Lights in the farmhouse burned until morning. The sound of footsteps moved steadily from room to room, long after the rest of the town had gone to bed. Sometimes, faint music drifted through the still air, a slow, unfamiliar tune played on an old piano no one had heard in years. The strangest part was the calm that followed. After each death, the family would go about their days in silence, tending the fields, mending fences, as though nothing had happened. Funerals were private, the graves unmarked, and within weeks it was as if the boy had never been there at all. By the time the decade was ending, the curse was no longer just a story passed between neighbors. It had become a certainty, an unspoken rule written into the land itself, one that no locked door, no watchful eye, and no prayer could break. The day Michael Murphy turned 21 passed like any other. At least from the outside, the house sat quiet beneath a pale sky, its shutters drawn tight against the late autumn light. No visitors came, no deliveries were made. Inside, the air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. There was no cake cooling in the kitchen, no wrapped gifts waiting on the table. No one spoke the word birthday. Michael moved through the rooms in silence, his footsteps muffled by worn rugs. He had known this day was coming for as long as he could remember. His older brothers had not lived to see it. Neither had his father, who died young in his own time. But unlike the others, Michael had been kept closer, watched more carefully. For months leading up to this day, his mother locked the doors each night and kept the keys on a chain around her neck. Windows were bolted, curtains never opened. That evening, the family sat together in the dim parlor. The only sound was the slow crackle of the fire. Michael's mother sat knitting, though her hands barely moved, the yarn slack in her lap. His younger sister stared into the flames. No one spoke to him directly. He didn't speak either. The clock on the mantel marked the hours with soft, steady chimes. When night came, Michael retired to his room without being told. The door shut behind him, the latch clicking in place. The moon was a thin silver line through the gap in the curtains. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, feeling the strange weight of time pressing against him. He must have drifted, though he could not remember closing his eyes. By morning, the house was colder. His mother knocked once on his door. Then again. When there was no answer, she unlocked it. Michael was lying on his back, the covers smooth around him, his eyes half open. His mouth hung slightly ajar, as if a word had been caught there and never spoken. There was no sign of struggle, no mark on his skin. The doctor found nothing. Heart and lungs intact. No sign of illness. No poison in his blood. It was as though something had simply taken the moment from him while he slept. The family buried him without ceremony. No headstone, no service. By the next week, the parlor curtains were open again, sunlight spilling across the floor as though nothing had happened. But in the silence of his room, the impression of his body on the bed remained, as if he had only just stepped away and might return at any moment. The Murphy barn had been abandoned for years, its roof sagging under the weight of seasons, its doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. By the 1970s, it was a place local teenagers dared each other to enter, especially after dark. They came for the thrill, for the chance to laugh at old ghost stories. But those who stepped inside rarely laughed for long. The air in the barn was always colder than outside. No matter the season, dust floated in slow spirals through the shafts of moonlight that slipped between the boards. The scent of hay still lingered faintly, though the loft had been empty for decades. It was in that loft, the stories said, that at least one Murphy boy had drawn his last breath. One autumn night, 3 teenagers slipped through the wide front doors, their flashlights cutting narrow paths through the dark. The beams caught old tools hanging on the walls, their edges dulled by time, and the tattered remains of a horse blanket draped over a rail. At first, it was just the creak of their footsteps and the restless shuffle of mice in the corners. Then, from somewhere above, came the sound of a low murmur. Not words exactly, but the rhythm of speech, like someone talking just out of earshot. They froze, straining to listen. The murmur stopped, replaced by a slow, heavy breathing that seemed to echo in the rafters. It was deep, deliberate, as though whatever was up there was aware of them, drawing each breath in time with their stillness. One of the boys, braver than the others, climbed the ladder to the hayloft. He later swore that the higher he climbed, the colder the air became, until it felt like stepping into a place where summer could never reach. At the top, his flashlight swept across the loft and stopped. A figure stood there, pale as bone, its face turned toward him. The eyes were black in the beam, wide and unblinking. It did not move, did not speak, but there was something in the way it stood that felt wrong, as though its shape was only an imitation of a man. Before he could call down to the others, the light flickered, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. They left without speaking, each certain they had heard the breathing follow them all the way to the road. The boy who saw the figure never went back. In the years since, others have claimed to hear whispers in that barn, but no one has admitted to climbing the loft again. Whatever waits up there, they say, prefers to be above you, watching. The house had been empty for months, its windows coated in dust, its walls sighing with every change of weather. When the demolition crew arrived in the spring of 1967, they found the old Murphy home stubborn, its timbers refusing to give way without protest. It was during the removal of the great stone fireplace in the parlor that one of the workers noticed a hollow space behind the mortar, a small dry cavity sealed with a loose brick. Inside was an envelope, thick with age and sealed in dark red wax. The paper was brittle to the touch, its edges curled like dried leaves. Across the front, in spidery black ink, was a name no one on the crew recognized: to the sons yet unborn. The wax cracked under the foreman's thumb, releasing a faint smell of soot and something older, something almost sweet. The letter inside was written in a careful, slanted hand, dated March 17, 1893, just months before Thomas Murphy Jr. would die on his 21st birthday. It began with a greeting, but there was no warmth in it. "You will know my name," it read, "and you will know why this paper finds you." The words were measured, deliberate, as if each stroke of the pen had been weighed before it was made. The letter spoke of a debt, though it gave no detail of how it was earned or to whom it was owed. "It will not pass to strangers," the writer warned. "It belongs to the blood, and the blood will answer." There was a strange rhythm to the sentences, almost like a prayer or a chant, each line drawing tighter around a single command: pay the debt in full, lest the house collect on its own. Some sentences seemed to be written for a listener rather than a reader, with pauses marked by dashes, as though the writer expected the words to be spoken aloud in a quiet room. Toward the end, the ink grew darker, heavier, as if pressed into the page with mounting urgency. "When the day comes, do not hide him. Do not fight it. To resist is to double the sum." The foreman read the letter twice, unsettled by the way it seemed to speak directly into the moment, as if it had been waiting 74 years for someone's hands to touch it. That night, he took it home, wrapped in oilcloth to keep the pages from crumbling. But in the weeks that followed, he refused to talk about it. The letter was never turned over to the Historical Society. Some say it was burned, others believe it was simply put back, somewhere in the bones of the Murphy house, waiting again. She was in her 80s when she finally agreed to speak on record, her voice thin but steady, her hands twisting a worn handkerchief as she searched her memory. She had been only 17 when she was hired at the Murphy house in the late 1920s, a kitchen girl first, then a housekeeper. She'd seen more than most, and forgotten even less. What she remembered most vividly was the ritual. It always began the same way. The night before one of the boys turned 21, the patriarch, whether it was Thomas Sr. or later his son Daniel, would ask for the sitting room to be cleared by sunset. No one, not wife, not daughter, not servant, was allowed inside once he shut the door. She learned early on that it wasn't worth asking why. From the hallway, she would smell the candles first. Not the sweet beeswax kind, but something heavier, sharper, the sort of scent that seemed to settle into the back of your throat. She would see the flicker under the crack of the door, a restless orange glow shifting against the floorboards. Through a keyhole once, she caught sight of them, 21 black candles, each in its own iron holder, arranged in a perfect circle on the carpet. The patriarch would sit in the center, on a straight-backed chair, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the flame directly in front of him. He did not blink often, and when he did, it was slow, deliberate, as if he feared missing something in the shadows beyond the light. The candles were always lit in silence, one after another, clockwise. She would watch the light fill the room, then dim, ever so slightly, as if the walls themselves were drawing closer. By midnight, the air inside seemed thick enough to touch, and a faint tremor would work its way through the floorboards. Whether from her own fear or something else, she could never decide. At dawn, without fail, the door would open. The candles were gone, though no one ever saw them removed. The patriarch would emerge looking years older, his hair damp as if from rain, his voice raw when he spoke. When she once found the courage to ask what the candles were for, his answer was short and final. The light must meet the dark halfway. After the first few times, she stopped asking. But she noticed that on the mornings after, the soon-to-be 21-year-old always looked pale, restless and oddly resigned. Every single one of them. The interview tapes, brittle from decades in storage, crackle with static before each voice emerges. Some are slow and hesitant, others quick and defensive, but one detail remains consistent. Whenever the conversation drifts toward the family's deeper past, toward the early 1800s, the Murphys stop talking. Sometimes it's abrupt, a half-sentence cut off by a sudden change of subject. Other times the silence hangs heavy, the microphone capturing nothing but the faint sound of breathing. And if the interviewer presses, the response is almost always the same, delivered in a flat, practiced tone. "We don't say that name." No one specifies what the name is. In most of the tapes, the interviewer doesn't even know enough to ask which name they mean. But in a few, there's a slip. A cousin who forgets herself and begins to speak it before another family member interrupts sharply. On one occasion, the tape catches the sound of a chair scraping back and a door closing, the interview effectively over. It isn't until decades later that a local historian, combing through parish records, manages to piece together who they might have meant. The man was Eamon Murphy, born in 1800, a distant ancestor whose name appears only in old legal transcripts and a handful of handwritten accounts. In 1821, on the night of his 21st birthday, Eamon was accused of the ritual murder of a neighbor's child. Witnesses swore they'd seen him in the woods with a lantern, his clothes spattered with something dark, carrying a bundle too small to be human, until it moved. No body was ever found. No trial ever completed. What is known is that Eamon was dead within a week, discovered in his own bed, his eyes open, and his mouth fixed in what one witness described as a terrible sort of smile. The church records stop there, but a marginal note in the priest's hand reads, "The debt has begun." The historian reviewing the material for a local heritage project brings the name up casually during an on-camera interview with one of the surviving Murphy descendants. The reaction is immediate. The man blanches, stands up, and demands the footage be destroyed. When asked why, his answer is eerily familiar, saying it draws attention. "You don't want its attention." The historian later admits that, from that day forward, he kept a small black stone on his desk. He couldn't explain why. He only knew it felt safer that way. The album itself is unremarkable at first glance. Cracked, leather cover, yellowed pages, the faint smell of dust and mildew. The photographs inside chart the passage of time in the Murphy family: christenings, harvest celebrations, holiday dinners. Faces grow older, children appear and vanish from one page to the next, and the backgrounds shift with the decades. It's only when you reach the center of the book that something feels wrong. The photo is labeled in a delicate, looping hand, "Murphy Reunion, 1901. The setting is the front lawn of the farmhouse. Every living family member is there, lined up in neat rows, their Sunday best pressed and proper. But behind the back row, half hidden by the tallest of the men, is a figure that shouldn't be there. They are taller than anyone else in the frame, impossibly so, even accounting for perspective. Their head nearly grazes the top edge of the photograph, and their posture is stiff, unnatural. Most unsettling of all, the face is nothing but a pale blur, as if the camera lens failed to capture it, or as though it had been smeared by an unseen hand before the print dried. At first it's easy to assume a trick of light, a flaw in the developing process, but as researchers flip through the rest of the album, that same figure appears again. In a portrait from 1925, the family has aged and new generations fill the frame, but there it is, standing at the far left this time, a head taller than the eldest uncle, face still blurred. A photo from 1948 shows the remaining Murphys gathered after a funeral. Rain blurs the background, but the figure is there, wedged between two mourners, its blurred face turned toward the camera. And in the final photograph, dated 1966, the farmhouse looks worn and tired, the family now reduced to a handful of individuals. They are standing in front of the barn, smiles forced for the lens. The figure is in the doorway behind them, its long arms hanging at its sides. What's most disturbing is that the photographs span over 60 years. Whoever, or whatever, it has not aged a day. When the album is shown to a surviving Murphy relative in the 1980s, she refuses to look past the first page. "It always stood there," she says quietly. "But you only saw it in pictures. That's why we stopped taking them." She pauses, then adds, "If you look too long, it might notice you." The album is now kept in a sealed box in the county archive. Archivists admit, reluctantly, that the blurred figure seems slightly closer to the camera in each successive image. They say you could set your watch by it. 3 knocks. Slow, measured, and always at midnight. The sound carried in the stillness of rural nights. Not the sharp rap of a visitor in haste, but a heavy, deliberate pounding, as though from a single knuckle against wood. Neighbors swore they heard it before every death in the Murphy family. Not once, not twice, but without fail, on the night before tragedy struck. The accounts are eerily consistent, even across decades. In 1914, the O'Haras, who lived half a mile down the dirt road, claimed they woke to the knocks and rose to answer, lantern in hand. When Mr. O'Hara opened the door, the night was still. No footsteps retreating, no wind in the grass, no sound at all, just the faint ticking of his hallway clock. In 1941, Mrs. Callahan, a widow living on the adjoining property, reported the same thing. She told the sheriff she waited after the knocks, expecting perhaps a neighbor in trouble. When she opened her door, she saw nothing but the Murphy farmhouse in the distance, a single upstairs window faintly lit. The next morning, news spread that another Murphy boy had been found dead. The strangest testimony comes from 1952, the year Michael Murphy died. A local teenager, unable to sleep, had been sitting by his bedroom window facing the road. At exactly midnight, he claimed he saw a tall, pale figure walk slowly up the Murphys' porch steps, raise a hand, and knock 3 times. It then turned, walked back into the dark, and vanished. He never saw its face. Some neighbors refused to speak of the knocks at all, believing that to acknowledge them was to invite them closer. Others took precautions, hanging horseshoes above their doors, salting their thresholds, or keeping a Bible open in the hallway. None of it seemed to make a difference. The knocks stopped the moment the last Murphy heir left the farmhouse in 1967. The house fell silent, the road overgrown, the barn leaning with age. But the story didn't die. In the 1980s, a couple who had recently moved into the area reported to police that they were woken one night by an unfamiliar sound. They described it in the same way, 3 slow, deliberate knocks at exactly midnight. They had never heard of the Murphy legend. The old-timers in town shook their heads when they heard. "If it says knocking," one said, "it says looking for someone to answer again." And then, almost as an afterthought, "Better hope it doesn't find the right door." By the mid-1970s, the Murphy name was more myth than memory to most in the county. A whispered cautionary tale for newcomers, a half-forgotten curse to the old guard. But for the surviving branch of the family, the legend was no relic. It was a clock, still ticking. 2 brothers were born within 3 years of each other, the last known Murphy sons. Their parents, descendants of the 2nd generation, lived in near total seclusion on the outskirts of town, in a heavily fenced property guarded by a pair of large dogs and an ever-present line of no trespassing signs. The boys never attended public school. No neighbors recalled seeing them play in the yard. Their lives were contained within the old farmhouse walls, broken only by brief, supervised trips into town for supplies. Former delivery drivers later described strange encounters, doors that opened only wide enough for a hand to take the goods, voices low and urgent, curtains always drawn. The boys were pale, quiet, and almost unnervingly polite, with a habit of glancing over their shoulders as though expecting someone, or something, to be standing behind them. The first son, Daniel, made it to his 21st birthday under these strict conditions. That morning, the family kitchen was set for breakfast, eggs on the plate, coffee steaming in the mug. Witnesses differ on whether he was alone or with his parents, but the end was the same. Without warning, Daniel stiffened, gasped, and collapsed forward into his food. Attempts to revive him failed. The coroner could find no cause of death. The second son, Aaron, became the focus of even tighter security. For 3 years after his brother's death, his parents reportedly barred him from using the telephone, from opening windows, even from sleeping alone. The closer he drew to his 21st birthday, the more frantic they became. Some accounts suggest that in the final weeks, they moved him into a locked upstairs room, where they could hear him pacing at night. On the night before his birthday, a fierce summer storm rolled in. Wind rattled the windows, rain pelted the roof, and the power went out. By dawn, Aaron was gone. No forced entry, no footprints in the mud. The upstairs door was still locked from the inside. His bed was cold. The Murphys filed no missing person report. When asked about their son, the parents refused to speak, and within a year they left town entirely. No trace of Aaron was ever found. Some say he escaped. Most believe the clock finally caught up with him. By the 1980s, the Murphy surname had all but vanished from county records. The once isolated farm was abandoned and later demolished, the land sold in parcels to developers who found nothing but overgrown fields and stubborn whispers of its past. On paper, it looked as though the bloodline, and whatever had plagued it, had ended with the 4th generation. But genealogy rarely leaves loose ends. County archives and church baptismal records tell a different story. Though the Murphy sons were gone, several Murphy daughters had survived into adulthood, marrying into other families and moving far from the shadow of the farm. They built lives elsewhere, new names, new homes, new futures. At first, nothing seemed amiss. There were no rumors of accidents or strange midnight knocks. The daughters bore children, and for a time the old curse felt like a chapter finally closed. Yet as the years passed, a disturbing pattern emerged, not in the daughters themselves, but in their children. One by one, their firstborn sons began to die, always at 21. A Chicago police report from 1987 records the sudden collapse of a college student named Christopher Dean. His mother, Margaret, was born Margaret Murphy, of the 3rd generation. No drugs, no signs of foul play. The coroner sets cause of death: undiagnosed cardiac event. In 1993, a San Diego surfer named Luke Henderson, son of Elaine Murphy Henderson, drowned in calm waters just beyond the shore. Witnesses say they saw him standing on his board, looking toward the beach, before simply vanishing beneath the surface. By the late 1990s, genealogists began privately connecting the dots. Death certificates, birth records, and marriage licenses revealed the link. The curse had not died with the Murphy boys. It had simply changed its path, following the blood rather than the name. Surviving Murphy daughters, now elderly, became hesitant to speak about their pasts. In one rare interview, a woman who had once been Mary Murphy Parker admitted that her own mother had warned her, "It doesn't matter if you change your name. The house knows where you are." Some families attempted to outwit the pattern, moving frequently, never celebrating birthdays, keeping their sons away from water, heights, or strangers. But the deaths came anyway, quietly, without explanation. The final known case on record occurred in 2008, when 21-year-old Jason Miller was found in his apartment, seated upright on his couch, eyes open, television still playing. His mother, Catherine Miller, was born Catherine Murphy, the last verified descendant of the original patriarch. After that, public records fall silent. But among amateur genealogists and local historians, there's an uneasy belief the curse isn't gone. It's just waiting for the next birthday. By the early 2000s, the Murphy curse had become a curiosity for amateur sleuths and paranormal researchers. But for Dr. Ellen Cray, a folklorist from the University of Virginia, it was more than just a strange family tragedy. It was part of a much older story. Dr. Cray's research traced the Murphy farmland to the banks of what early settlers called the Black River, though no such river appeared on modern maps. In colonial accounts from the late 1600s, the river was described as a narrow, pitch-dark channel of water that flowed silently through the valley before vanishing underground. Local Algonquian oral tradition told of a vein of the earth that swallowed men whole and returned only what it chose. As Dr. Cray dug deeper, she found repeated references to the river, taking what it is owed. The debt, according to scattered stories, could be paid in many forms: crops, livestock, or, when none of those sufficed, blood. In these tales, families who settled too close to its banks would find themselves counted by the river, the eldest son marked first. Geological surveys revealed something chilling. The Murphy farmland sat directly above a buried waterway that matched the Black River's last recorded position. In the 1800s, farmers noted that wells on the Murphy property would sometimes fill with dark, brackish water overnight, only to run clear again by morning. No one drank from them when the water turned, not after the livestock deaths. In the basement of the abandoned Murphy home, Dr. Cray found physical evidence. The stone foundation had been built directly over a natural fissure in the rock, through which faintly damp air still rose. When she dropped a weighted line, it struck water less than 20 feet down, black as ink, even under flashlight. Locals who still remembered the old stories refused to let her test the water. "You don't just wake it," one elderly farmer told her. "Not unless you sit ready to give it something." According to Dr. Cray's notes, the legend of the Black River long predates the town itself. Some accounts suggest that long before the Murphys built their farmhouse, an older settlement had been abandoned after every firstborn male in the community died within a single year. No graves from that period have ever been found, only a cluster of crude stone markers on a ridge above where the river once surfaced. Whether the Murphys knew of the river before buying the land remains unclear, but Dr. Craysip's final conclusion was simple, written in the margin of her field journal. The house didn't start the curse. The ground did. In 2011, a small team of paranormal investigators from Richmond set up overnight in the abandoned Murphy home. The house had been empty for more than 4 decades, its windows boarded, its roof sagging under the weight of years. Even so, neighbors swore they still heard sounds from inside, footsteps, chairs scraping, and once, a child's laughter. The team arrived just before dusk, placing digital audio recorders in every room. Their plan was to run a standard EVP, electronic voice phenomenon session, a method that in their experience usually yielded little more than static. But the Murphy house was different. Within the first hour, one recorder in the front parlor picked up something faint, a rhythmic, low murmur coming from beneath the floorboards. When the clip was played back, the sound grew unmistakable. It was a voice, hushed, gravelly, and slow. The words were in English. "Count them down. Count them down." The phrase repeated 3 times before trailing off into silence. The team assumed it was interference from another device. But when they checked, every recorder in the house had captured something, not the same voice, but multiple voices, some speaking in overlapping whispers. A few were in English, asking vague, fragmented questions like, "Whose turn is it?" and "Where is the candle?" Others spoke in a language none of them could recognize, a guttural, looping dialect that seemed to repeat certain sounds like a chant. At 1:14 a.m., one investigator was crouched near a corner in the upstairs hallway when she felt a vibration under her hands, as though someone below was knocking on the floorboards from inside the crawl space. Yet the Murphy house had no true crawl space, only a narrow gap above the stone foundation. Later, while reviewing the recordings from that moment, they found the clearest clip of the night. In the background of the knock, a male voice whispered something unintelligible, then in English said, "Not yet." The team left before sunrise, shaken. In their report, they noted that every whisper seemed to originate from directly beneath the central rooms, the same area where Dr. Cray had previously found the fissure leading down to the underground water. Some speculate that the voices are nothing more than echoes of the living, stray radio waves, wind in the walls. But others, pointing to the count them down refrain, believe the house is still keeping track, still waiting for the next name to cross its threshold. Chapter 19. The Missing Birth Records. 460 words. In 1984, a local journalist named Ellen Price began compiling a detailed family tree of the Murphys for a feature in the County Historical Journal. What began as a routine genealogical project quickly turned unsettling. When she visited the town archives, she found that birth certificates for several Murphy boys, names that had been mentioned repeatedly in interviews, simply did not exist. For example, neighbors remembered a Thomas Murphy born in 1928. Several swore they'd seen him as a child, fishing by the creek with his older brothers. A retired schoolteacher insisted he'd been in her class for 2 years before falling ill. Yet when Ellen combed through state vital records, there was nothing, no birth registration, no baptismal entry, not even a census listing. The same was true for at least 5 other boys, spanning 3 generations. Each had been described by multiple unrelated witnesses. Each appeared in at least one photograph, usually in the background of larger family gatherings. And each vanished from the public record, as though they had never existed at all. The gaps didn't appear to be clerical errors. Records for daughters born in the same years were present and perfectly intact. Even the death certificates for the official Murphy sons matched the dates and causes, or lack thereof, already tied to the family curse. It was only these shadowy, undocumented boys who existed in memory but not in ink. When Ellen confronted a surviving Murphy cousin about the missing papers, the woman's face reportedly drained of color. She shut the door without a word. A week later, Ellen received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a scrap of lined paper bearing a single handwritten message, traded before they draw breath. The wording ignited a firestorm of speculation in the community. Some claimed the Murphys had made some kind of generational bargain, a ritual exchange of unborn or unregistered children in order to buy time for the rest. Others argued that these boys were hidden deliberately, perhaps raised elsewhere under different names, to escape the fate of dying at 21. Ellen's final article never ran. She told colleagues that her notes had gone missing from her locked desk and the photographs she'd collected. The few images where the unrecorded sons appeared were gone as well. The only trace left of her work was a penciled line in her research journal. If they weren't set born, the curse couldn't set find them, but it always does. In 2003, while cataloging artifacts in the county's crumbling courthouse basement, archivist Daniel Whitaker found a bundle of water-stained papers, sealed with a wax emblem long faded to a dull brown. Among them was a single legal document, dated April 6, 1822, its edges brittle, its ink a deep rust color. The heading read simply, Articles of Agreement. One party was named in clear, bold script, Patrick Murphy Sr., the man historians recognize as the first Murphy to settle on the farmland. The other party's name was absent, replaced by a black smear, as if the ink had been deliberately blotted out at the time of writing. The language was formal, almost ceremonial. It promised prosperity, protection, and the flourishing of all earthly holdings in exchange for an unnamed offering. The text made repeated references to the bloodline remaining unbroken and the debt recurring in the fullness of its count. As Curvenderaisen, destum no fugit. Then, near the bottom, came the most chilling clause. Upon the turning of the 21st year, the debt shall be satisfied in full. The 21st year belongs to me. The document was signed in Murphy's unmistakable handwriting, alongside the smudged, illegible mark of the second party. Below the signatures was a wax seal, unlike any used in local legal practice, an intricate circular pattern surrounding what appeared to be a river, with 3 small dots above it. Local historians were immediately divided on the document's authenticity. Some believed it was a fabrication, perhaps created decades later to explain the family's misfortunes. Others argued that the language mirrored certain obscure 19th century protection pacts tied to Irish and Scottish folk traditions, agreements with supernatural benefactors in return for wealth or land security. Adding weight to the latter theory was the fact that 1822 was the year the Murphys first expanded their farm by acquiring a massive tract of land that until then had been considered uninhabitable marsh. Within a decade, the family became one of the most prosperous in the county, avoiding the crop failures, livestock plagues, and bank foreclosures that ruined their neighbors. The document mysteriously vanished from the courthouse's holdings just 2 weeks after its discovery. Whitaker insisted it had been there when he locked up for the night, but by morning the folder was gone, replaced by a single blank sheet of parchment, and disturbingly, a faint wet ring as if something had been set upon it. The only remaining record of the agreement now exists in Whitaker Sepp's meticulous transcription, preserved in his personal journal. At the very bottom of that page, he added a single note in his own hand. If this was a bargain, the Murphys paid it, and they sir still paying. In the spring of 1998, after decades of abandonment and repeated trespassing incidents, the county finally ordered the last standing Murphy residence to be torn down. The 2-story farmhouse, leaning slightly to the east, sat on a patch of overgrown land where the grass seemed darker than the surrounding fields. Its windows had long been boarded shut, but neighbors swore that some nights faint lamplight still flickered behind the planks. The demolition crew arrived on a bright Monday morning. By noon, 3 separate machines had failed without explanation. Hydraulic lines burst in brand new equipment. A backhoe's engine seized despite having been serviced the day before. The foreman, a man with 20 years of experience, swore it felt as if the house didn't want to let go. As the day wore on, workers began complaining of sudden nausea and dizziness. One man vomited repeatedly in the bushes and insisted he could taste metal in his mouth. Another collapsed after reporting a sudden stabbing pain in his chest, yet hospital tests later showed nothing wrong. By the second day, they noticed a smell. It wasn't constant, but came in waves, carried on sudden gusts of wind, thick, clinging, unmistakable, the stench of rotting flesh. The odor seemed to seep up from the ground itself, especially near the barn's old foundation. One worker described it as digging into a grave you didn't know was there. But when soil samples were taken, no human or animal remains were found. When the final wall came down, several crew members claimed to hear something beneath the crash, not the echo of timber, but a deep, resonant knock, like a fist striking wood from underground. It came 3 times, slow, even, and then it stopped. County officials dismissed the stories as a mix of overwork and local superstition. But the crucips foreman quietly refused future jobs in the area, telling colleagues, "I've done teardowns after fires, floods, and worse." But that house, it fought back. Within months, the cleared lot became a patch of bare earth where nothing grew. Grass stopped at its edges. Even weeds withered before breaking through the soil. Today, the land remains fenced off. Its gate chained and padlocked, not for safety, but because, as one councilman put it, it's better to leave certain places alone. The last Murphy house was gone. But according to those who passed the empty lot at night, something else stayed. Family whispers speak of a boy named Thomas Murphy, though some insist that wasn't his real name. In 1938, at just 19 years old, he vanished from the Murphy home without a word. Some say his mother helped him leave under the cover of darkness. Others believe he slipped away on his own, driven by a terror his family never dared name aloud. Thomas had grown up hearing the same stories as every Murphy boy: never speak of him, never be out after midnight, never look toward the barn if the door is open. But unlike his brothers and cousins, Thomas refused to wait for his 21st birthday. He sold an old silver pocket watch, took the cash, and boarded a train headed for New York. From there, the trail splits into rumor and record. A handful of postcards surfaced years later. Sent from Lisbon, then Casablanca, then Buenos Aires. They were short, almost terse, signed only with a single initial. Still alive. One read, "Sun is warm here." Another, "I think I've outrun it." By 20, Thomas had settled in a coastal village in South America. He'd taken on a new name. Locals remembered him as a quiet man who worked on fishing boats and spoke broken Spanish with an Irish lilt. He married a school teacher, and together they were expecting their first child. In the weeks leading up to his 21st birthday, neighbors noticed Thomas seemed distracted. He'd glance over his shoulder during conversations. He refused to work after sunset. He kept the doors barred, even in the midday heat. His wife recalled waking one night to find him standing at the window, staring out toward the sea, whispering something over and over that she couldn't understand. On the evening before his birthday, Thomas went into town to buy bread and candles. He never returned. Witnesses reported hearing a screech of tires near the docks, followed by the sound of wood splintering. A delivery cart had lost control. Its horse panicked, and it struck Thomas full force, throwing him against a stone wall. Locals claimed the scene was strange, as if the accident happened in silence. No shouts, no panic. Only the impact, and then the sight of Thomas lying still, his eyes open, mouth parted as though caught mid-word. His wife later received a letter from an unknown sender in the United States. It contained only one line, written in careful script: "You cannot run from what is owed." The Murphys never spoke Thomas's name again. But in the old family Bible, on the page for births, his entry was left blank. No death date recorded, just an empty space where the ink should have been. The documentary's final act shifts from yellowed photographs and crumbling letters to the glowing blue interface of a modern genealogical database. Lines stretch across the screen, connecting names, dates, and places, the sprawling Murphy family tree laid bare. But it's the pattern, not the size, that makes the stomach tighten. No direct male Murphy descendant, nor even those whose surnames changed through marriage, has ever lived past their 21st birthday. From the early 1800s to the present day, the records end abruptly. A death certificate, a coroner's note, or in some cases, simply nothing but the absence of future entries. The research team verifies against obituaries, census logs, military records, and immigration documents. Each time, the result is the same. Whether in rural Ireland, industrial New England, the Australian outback, or the streets of modern Tokyo, the men are gone before their lives have truly begun. The narrator's voice lowers. If this is coincidence, it is one so precise and relentless that it might as well be fate. Some cases seem almost banal. A drowning during a summer swim, a sudden illness, a car accident on a rainy road. Others border on the inexplicable collapse without cause. Missing persons never found, bodies discovered in places they had no reason to be. A final name appears on the screen. No birth date yet, only an infant photo pulled from a public social media account. He is the great-great-great-grandson of a Murphy daughter, born in 2024. The connection is faint on paper, but the blood is there. His father, smiling in the picture, holds him close. The narrator pauses before speaking again. If the curse is real, somewhere at this moment, another countdown has already begun. 21 years. The clock is ticking. The screen fades to black, replaced by the slow, steady sound of a grandfather clock. Each tick echoes longer than it should, as if coming from far away. The sound grows louder, almost swallowing the silence between beats. Then the faintest sound of 3 slow knocks. The credits roll.